Benjamin Anderson currently serves as CEO at Kearney County Hospital, a comprehensive rural health complex located in southwest Kansas. He was raised in an urban community on the West Coast, and Anderson experienced poverty during some of his childhood years. These formative experiences played a major role in his commitment to equity and justice, with special attention toward underserved and marginalized people. His career in healthcare administration began in 2009 as CEO of Ashland Health Center, a struggling hospital and the only health provider in a Kansas town of 900 people. There, he led an effort that dramatically revitalized the community's healthcare services, recruiting and retaining several medical providers to serve a multi-county area between Kansas and Oklahoma. Since arriving at Kearney County Hospital, Anderson received national acclaim for his work in physician recruitment, health promotion, women's health initiatives, and rural healthcare delivery innovation. He was named to the 2014 Modern Healthcare Up-and-Comer list. He earned his Bachelor of English and Master of Business Administration degrees at Drury University in Springfield, Missouri, and his Master of Healthcare Delivery Science degree from Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. And now, please join me in welcoming Benjamin Anderson.
Thank you, Devin. I appreciate it. Thank you all for having me. How's everyone doing? Is everyone caffeined up? Are y'all so progressive that you're no longer drinking caffeine? No, you're still in that, right? I saw the You're Sweet Enough campaign, and I want to shamelessly plagiarize that. That's brilliant. But I didn't see that you've already had enough caffeine campaign. So I'm with you. Thank you all so much for having me. I love this region of the country, and I was in school, as somebody mentioned, with Steve Leffler at Dartmouth at the Healthcare Delivery Science program, and it was my first time in the Northeast, ever being in the Northeast, to go up there, and so I didn't know at all what to expect, and I learned that Vermont and New Hampshire couldn't be more different in some ways. One is sort of live free or die, right? And then the other one is perhaps on the other end of the political spectrum, but I love being here, and I love the opportunity to be with you. And each time that I get to speak with a group like this, I pull out so much more that I bring back to a very underserved place in the world, in the middle of America. And so You're Sweet Enough was my first takeaway. I had barely even gotten down here for breakfast before I figured out my first takeaway to take home. So thank you for having me here. So I tell stories. And I've got an hour to share some with you. And with those stories, I share some lessons that we've learned the hard way in hopes that you don't have to learn them the hard way. All right? So I'm going to share those with you from the lens of a hospital CEO in one of the most remote or underserved places in the United States of America. All right? So the first story I'm going to tell you is a story about love. And it might not look like it at first glance. How many of you all do morning safety huddles in your hospitals? All right, so you get together, you go through the day, you go through volumes, you go through whatever measures you're tracking. You might track mission-focused moments, or you might track smart catches or things like that, right? And you set out the day to make sure you're in good shape. Well, we do that as well at Kearney County Hospital, and in the morning we share stories. Each morning we try to find some way that in the last 24 hours we lived out the mission of the place in an extraordinary way. And if we go too many days without finding something like that, we realize we're off in the weeds. We better recenter, get back to where we said we were, with providing quality, compassionate healthcare services for our community to enrich the lives of our family, friends, and neighbors, right? So we recite that. Well, this is one of those stories with a little bit more detail than we would normally share in a morning safety huddle. So I'm the CEO of a hospital, a rural frontier hospital that also has an attached assisted living unit, and it has attached long-term care. Anybody have attached long-term cares in Vermont? Is that just a Kansas thing? So our aging services are all under one roof. So great-grandma can wheel herself down and watch her great-granddaughter be born in the middle of a snowstorm and go back home, and it's all right there. So I got a call from the director of nursing in our nursing home saying that there's a a gentleman is a resident in our nursing home that was not being very kind to our staff, using some inappropriate language, wet back, not knocked up, spick, like really, really awful language toward our staff. And she said, "This man's not ambulatory and we can't evict him. Would you please deal with him?" I thought, this is a dandy. So I went down the hall to sit down and meet with him, and I said, "Sir, how are you?" And he wheeled himself in and he said, "Not good." I said, "And why is that?" He said, "You got a bunch of half-breeds working here." I bristled up and I said, "Sir, can you see how calling somebody a half-breed might be taken as offensive or disrespectful?" He said, "What do you want me to call him?" I said, "Well, as the father of several children who are half white, half Hispanic, I prefer to call them David, Naomi, and Maria. They have names. They deserve to be treated with respect. You have a name. You deserve to be treated with respect. I don't want them called half-breeds any more than I want you called the old bald guy in the wheelchair." As you might have gathered, I didn't handle that situation very well. It ended abruptly with no commitment for changed behavior, and I was mad. I was hopping mad. And I can't evict the guy, right? So this is the mentality I'm in. I'm just really frustrated. And so I go back with him. I said, "Man, I think we got off on a rough start. I want to take you out for a steak dinner. You got to understand the context of my offer. This picture was taken 25 miles east of my house, literally. I think I took it. This is the skyline of Garden City, Kansas. And the ultimate expression of love in our culture is an overly sized, partially cooked piece of red meat." Right, so I'm thinking, can't go wrong with a steak. I'm going to offer this guy a steak. I said, how about I take you out to a steak, to anywhere you want to go, any restaurant. He goes, "Ain't got no damn teeth. What the hell am I supposed to do with a steak?" I thought, man, you got a point. I'm thinking in my mind, those four in the front, those are clutch. And they're not there. That's a good point, man. That was really insensitive of me to offer you a steak. I said, I'm grasping at this point. I said, "How about a beer?" And you look left and you look right. And he goes, "Now that I'll do." I said, "What's your flavor?" He said, "Bud." I said, "Bud Light?" He said, "Bud Heavy." I'm like, all right. Oh, Budweiser. All right, so I get it. All right. I don't really drink beer, not much beer. I'm certainly not into Bud Heavy. I'm sure that's not on y'all's, You're Sweet Enough campaign, right? That's like drinking a steak, right? If that's another way to have a steak. You can drink one. So I realized what he was after, and so I went down, risked my reputation, went down to the local liquor store, picked up a 6-pack of Budweiser bottles, and at 5:30 in the afternoon, walked right past the nurse's station in this nursing home to sit down and choke down a Budweiser Heavy with this guy. And once a week, we started doing this and sitting down, and I started learning his story and realizing where he came from. And I realized that he grew up in abject poverty. And I learned that he had experienced amazing abuse during his childhood. And if y'all are familiar with an adverse childhood experience score, this guy's score was an 8 or a 9 or a 10. I mean, if bad could happen to this guy, it did. And so as I continued to get to know him, I learned that there was this doctor. I knew this doctor that's in our hospital, that's America's favorite physician, was essentially fired by this guy with a series of expletives that start with the letter F. Won't repeat those. I've cursed enough, I suppose, in the first 5 minutes of this talk. But he'd fired him because he wouldn't let him leave the hospital when he wanted to. And I learned that where he was when he came in to the hospital was he was living in the unfinished attic of someone's house without heating, air conditioning, adequate electricity, or even sewage, and someone was charging him rent out of his Social Security for that. And he got to where he couldn't sustain there, and he came into the ED so sick that the doctor worried he was going to die, but when the doctor said, "You can't leave, you're losing your independence," is how he took it, he fired him with all those bad words, right? And so I learned that he later regretted that, and part of it is because this guy, every once in a while, a guy comes along who's 6'2" and tall, dark, and handsome, and plays college-level basketball and concert-level piano, and has a deep, soothing voice, and is a great listener and a brilliant clinician, and this is the doctor that he fired, right? Dr. Miller. And so I can't imagine Dr. Miller being fired by anyone. He's such a wonderful person. Well, I learned that he regretted that, and I said, have you ever thought about apologizing to him? And I could tell it was like, what is that? And so, okay, all right, that's premature. Well, let's have some more Budweiser heavies. We'll do this, right? And all the while, the staff is pissed. I mean, how dare you go in there and, first of all, you're drinking at work. And in West Kansas, we don't do that. You might drink wine around here, but I mean, we don't do that, And so I made sure it was at 5:30. No one could get me on some sort of policy, right? So I continued to have these times with them, and I said, okay, apologies premature. Then I went and spoke at Becker's Hospital Conference in Chicago. And while I was there, the director of nursing texted me this picture of a bouquet of flowers, and this resident had spent half of his Social Security allowance for the month buying these flowers, putting them at the nurse's station. And it said, to everyone except this one nurse, thank you so much for the care that you're providing. And I got back and I sat down over a beer with this guy and said, thanks for doing that. Did you have to leave the one out? And he didn't say a thing, he just smirked at me. And so I left, and later on I would be traveling again, and I got another text, and it was the same bouquet of flowers ordered from the flower shop again, this time not leaving anyone out. This was a slow process that happened. And so then I went back to the apology thing, and I said, you don't have to say it to him, you could just write it down. And he said, man, they pulled me out of school in the 3rd grade, and I don't read so good. And it hit me. This guy's illiterate. He has spent his entire life not being able to read a menu or a book or a magazine or an article or the name on a street sign or a contract or a written idea. And it's no wonder he's pissed when he sees somebody that does not share his gender, that does not share his skin color, who's 17, who's wiping her bottom as she's passing him up on her way to college, and it did not excuse his terrible behavior toward our staff. But at least out of it came some empathy. So it said, well, man, I was still blown away that he was telling me he couldn't write. He could write his name. And I said, well, if you tell me what to write, I'll write it in a card and you can just sign it. And he said, that I'll do. So he wrote this card. He said, Dr. Miller, you're the best doctor I've ever had. I'm very sorry for the way I mistreated you and the hell I put you through. Don't know where if I'd be if it wasn't for you. Probably stuck in the VA somewhere. I hope you'll forgive me, Don George. And if you're with the VA, he didn't mean it personally. Or maybe he did, I don't know. But he gave this, or we gave it to Dr. Miller, and he died a couple weeks later in his sleep. And he died knowing what it meant to love and to be loved, and to forgive and to be forgiven. Isn't that what we can all hope for? Is to know that. And this guy taught me lessons that I'd hope I never, ever forget. And we're so tempted when we see that patient come into the ED to say, here's the alky. Here's a gallbladder acting up. Doc, you going to take it out? An addict. A woman that goes repeatedly into an abusive relationship and won't seem to step out of it. There's so many things that we can look at face value and judge. But it was so important for me to learn from him. There's way more to this story. So anyway, that's our opener. We don't normally go into that much detail in a morning safety huddle, but felt like for this group it would be helpful to have some context. So that really sets the stage for the next 45 minutes or so that we're going to visit. I have a hero, and she's one of my closest professional mentors, and her name is Sister Mary Jean Ryan. And she is a Catholic nun, part of SSM in St. Louis, and she is a relentless advocate for quality. And one of the one of the things she's known for is that she was the first, she led the first organization to ever receive the National Malcolm Baldrige Award. Before Baldrige was even a healthcare thing, it was still in manufacturing. She saw it as a model and said, we got to pursue quality, we're going to do it. And sister, I cold called her when I read something about her in the New York Times that she was retiring and she was the last of an order of nuns, or an age of nuns that were running health systems. They were being transferred to lay people, and anyway, there was a big feature on her, and so I just cold called her and said, my name's Benjamin and I'm running a tiny little hospital in the middle of nowhere, and I've really not worked in a hospital very long at all. This is my first job in a hospital, and my place is about to close, and I don't really have a built-in mentor. Would you be willing to take calls from me every once in a while? And so for the last 11 years, that's what she's been doing, is taking my phone calls. And she taught me a lesson that I'd like to share with you, and it's that any instance where a person is avoidably harmed due to broken processes or even good processes that could be better, and harm occurs, that harm is avoidable and therefore morally unacceptable. It ain't okay if that happens. And like a good nun, she added in an extra layer, people's lives are in your hands, you better get after this. What she was sharing with me is that systems heal people and systems harm or kill people. More than a good doctor or a bad doctor, the right or wrong diagnosis or the right or wrong prescription, systems full of well-intended people actually harm people. And if we know that there are things that we can do that would improve systems, then we must do them. Now, I'm not standing here in front of you claiming to run the perfect system or claiming to run a system that can go some extended period of time without any avoidable harm, although that is the goal. But I think it's first good for us to acknowledge that it is systems that do that, and systems are made up of us, and so if we can avoid it, let's do it. So our agenda here is we're going to share a little window into a rural healthcare delivery through a personal story, hopefully relating to some of the things you all might face. Shift that focus to ask, are we asking the right questions? Introduce a system integration tool that improves outcomes, and then talk about measurable impacts of patient-centered care. So I'm hoping that is okay with you because it's all I brought. All right. So, after 5 years of praying for kids, no kids, we were super blessed to adopt a pair of twins, boy and girl. And David and Naomi were their names. They were born in Wichita, Kansas. Healthy birth, no drama. Very excited to go home as parents for the first time. And we got away in this little cabin in the middle of nowhere for our first couple of days as parents, and then went back to the house after that and just started settling in as part of our maternity, paternity leave space. We started getting to know our kids and spending time with them, and it was wonderful. Well, about 30 days in to being parents, our daughter quit eating regularly. She would still eat, but she would eat an ounce and spit it up, and eat an ounce and spit it up, and something wasn't going right. And at the time, I was the CEO of a little place called Ashland Health Center, which is in a town of 951 people when everybody's in town and no one's on vacation. And we had 2 doctors that I had just recruited because we had none when I became the CEO. There were no doctors and no CEO, and so it was part of a major turnaround that was happening pretty early on in that process. So I'd just recruited these 2 doctors that had come in that were really solid board-certified family physicians, and so they were in town, but we brought our daughter in, and they thought, well, she's dehydrated. Maybe that's why her heart rate is elevated, because it was elevated. So they had a really good rural nurse get an IV into the head of a 30-day-old infant who was dehydrated, and that's how they were able to administer some fluids. So we brought her into this ED of this old Hillburton hospital, and we were admitted into the hospital. She became hydrated, and her heart rate was still in the mid-2s. Something was going on. And our doctors had never seen something like this in a kid this young. They just really weren't sure what was going on, but they were new, and they didn't really understand where to refer people just yet, because we hadn't had all the specialists come out, or we hadn't had the representatives from the different hospitals come out and share about their services. So they were calling Children's Mercy in Kansas City, they were calling Denver Children's Hospital, they were calling Via Christi in Wichita, and Wesley in Wichita, and calling around trying to figure out what do we do. So they finally found, okay, well, where we send this person isn't necessarily determined by who's the most qualified, but what is the means by which we can get them there? And so There had just been a snowstorm 3 days earlier, and the nearest runway, which was in a neighboring county, hadn't been cleared from snow. They just didn't have a system in place to make sure that runway stayed clear, so we couldn't use that runway, and it was too much fog to use a helicopter that day. And so we scrambled for hours as our daughter was being given a drug called adenosine for a condition called supraventricular tachycardia, or SVT. Some of y'all are clinical, and I can see you nodding going, yep, that's no good, right? I'm a 30-day-old baby. So trying to figure out how we get out. Well, I didn't have the system in place to clear the runway. It's not my job. It's another county. It's not my problem until it's my kid, and then it becomes a serious problem if I don't have a way to transfer my kid. And so then we finally figure out after a few hours that we're going to go to Wichita, Kansas, because there is a pediatric cardiologist with this system in Wichita who may be able to look at her. We got to get her there, and so we got her in an EMS truck with volunteer EMS people down to Oklahoma, 30 or 40, 45 miles away to a nearby airstrip there, to get her back up into Wichita on an airplane that didn't have an infant cardiac monitor on it. Would that be necessary if you've got a 30-day-old in SVT? Dr. Leffler, you can help me out. That would probably be necessary. Okay, thank you. And so didn't have an infant cardiac monitor on there. I hadn't checked for that. That's not my job. It's their job to make sure that they have the tools they need, except that it became my problem when it's my kid, and I could have transported her just as safely and just as quickly in my private vehicle 2.5 hours away, the back of my private vehicle, because there's nothing they were going to do for her that I couldn't have done, and I could essentially do nothing except hug her, kiss her on the forehead, because they didn't have the equipment they needed to make sure she was safe. So I leave at middle of the night and get there about 3:20 in the morning, and she arrives at 3:25, all right? Something like that, within 5 minutes of when I arrive by private vehicle. And what happens is she goes into this NICU with an intensivist who proceeds to manage her care, but really can't manage her care because there's a pediatric cardiologist / electrophysiologist that's on the phone dealing with a family medicine resident who's administering this drug called adenosine over and over and over again. All right. So we're standing in the corner as we're watching all this stuff play out, and they're giving more and more shots of adenosine. And as they're doing that, more and more people are showing up into her room. Residents, med students, PA students, nurses, nursing students, other specialists. And they're not saying a whole lot to us. In fact, they're not saying much to us as we're asking where this doctor is, because he wasn't showing up and he was just on the phone. No one had talked to us about stuff. And he's just saying, I'm not sure when he's going to be here. He'll get here when he can get here. I'm not sure what he's doing. I can't speak for him. And we kept asking and asking and asking what's going on. So after 5 hours, it became apparent that people were showing up and standing by her crib side going, I'm going to stick around and see how this one turns out. I might not get to see another one like this in my whole career. I'm sticking around. Like our daughter's some sort of interesting clinical experiment. But no one's sharing it with us. No one's telling us what's going on. So after 5 hours and 20 minutes, dude shows up. Hey, I'm Dr. So-and-so. I'm your kid's pediatric cardiologist. How are you? I said, sir, with all due respect, we do respect you. We're scared and frustrated. Where have you been? He said, I've been managing this case since 3:20 in the morning. I wouldn't have done anything different if I was here in person. Have a seat and I'll explain what's going on with your kid. And I'm stunned right now because the thing that happens in healthcare is that health literacy goes out the window when it's your kid. I mean, I'm a hospital CEO. I know this stuff works, right? I'm voiceless when it's my kid and I'm a new father and I'm watching my daughter seemingly suffering and I can't figure out like what's going on. No one's really sharing this stuff with me. And I didn't really have the capacity, at least at that moment, to talk back to him and go, wait a minute, that's crap. Like, you don't talk to us that way. We're asking questions. This is our kid. Didn't have the capacity to do that. He's in the position of power, not me. Right? So he said, I'll explain what's going on in your kid, and he begins to explain what SVT is, and it's an electrical issue that causes the heart to beat 3 times as fast as it should, and it's not filling up with blood like it should, therefore it's not getting blood, and therefore oxygen out to other parts of the body like the brain and the lungs and the extremities. And so this is going on with her daughter, and they keep giving her this drug called adenosine that restarts her heart and gets her back to normal. Then anything that agitates her just sends her back up into the mid to high 2s, because it keeps climbing each time she goes back into SVT. And so as he's explaining this to us, the intensivist comes in and says, doctor, we can't get a central line on this little girl. We need your help right now. That little girl is my little girl. And they were still using the same dinky IV that our rural nurse put in the night before as the only access to adenosine. Because anytime they tried to put in a central line, they couldn't get a central line without agitating her and sending her back into SVT. So he runs out to go do that, to help with that, and she sits down and says, if this were my kid, I'd get her to Denver Children's Hospital right now. And I said, well, earlier I'd said, doctor, should we get our kid to the Mayo Clinic or somewhere like that? Because at the time, a good friend of mine was the president of this hospital system who was formerly at the Mayo Clinic as the chief administrative officer. So I knew he had connections there and could help us with a quick transfer to that. And the doctor had responded saying, I'm not just a pediatric cardiologist, I'm an electrophysiologist. I'll send your kid wherever you want me to send your kid, but this is what I do. So I was coming off fresh off of that, and then she's telling me I'd get her to Denver Children's Hospital. I said, why not the Mayo Clinic? And she said, even when I trained at Vanderbilt, I knew that if a kid was in the possible need of a heart transplant, you want to go to Denver. I said, heart transplant? Who's talking about a heart transplant? What is going on with our kid? What is going on with her? She said, look, you are in the position of power as her parent. You get to decide where she goes, not him. You have the trump card. He comes back in and I said, doctor, I think we're going to go to Denver Children's Hospital. He paused for about 30 seconds and he said, I've got a good idea. Let's send your daughter to Denver Children's Hospital. I said, good idea, doc. Let's go there. And so this plane gets called in. All the while, I'm still not really sure. No one's ever communicated how sick she is. And so this plane shows up right after this doctor shows up, who's an ED physician living in Birmingham, Alabama, but she trained at this hospital. We knew her since residency. We happened to name our daughter Naomi after Dr. Naomi Hill. She happened to be up there that day for another a baby shower of another family that we both knew, and came in to see her namesake. And she said, your daughter's really sick. Her life's in danger. Were you aware of this? I said, kind of. Not really. And she said, every parent has the right to be involved in the plan of care of their child. That is non-negotiable. They need to communicate what's going on with you. So at that moment, I looked at the Flight for Life nurse and said, what are the chances our daughter codes on this flight? She said, very real. I don't know if she's well enough to ship her. And then it hit me, okay, a term's coming back to me as a hospital CEO. It's this term called dumping. Anybody familiar with that? So in the 1980s, hospitals got in the habit of shipping dying patients to other hospitals to up their mortality rates, right? So they'd keep their mortality rates low, so you had to have a federal law that was put in that prohibited hospitals from dumping dying patients in other hospitals. And it's not that they were trying to do that, but that's what they had to think, is she well enough to ship, or is she just going to die here? And so they were trying to get her stable enough to ship her at that point. And I thought, how did it come to this? And we were not involved. What is going on? So we did get her stabilized. This time it was me on the airplane, and I remember specifically hearing from my wife, Kayla, who said, whatever decision you make on that plane, I support you. She said that believing or knowing that she may never get to see Naomi again. And she didn't want me carrying that with me. Like, she wanted just to know, look, I support you. I support you. And so we got on this Learjet and we went 70 minutes over the clouds, no turbulence, no drama, no episodes. And for the first hour and 48, she slept peacefully. So we got there, we landed at 5:30 in rush hour. And there were sirens and sharp turns and honking horns and stops and goes and chaos. And the nurses are in the back, and Naomi's in SVT, and her heart rate's at 330, and her oxygen is at 30%, and she's writhing around. She's really struggling, and it's the first emergency I'd ever been through that was post-social media, and I've since sworn off Facebook like Vermonters have sworn off sugar. I'm off. But I was on Facebook at the time, and so I was just updating play by play, and 1,500, 2,000, 2,500 people were responding just within moments with thoughts and prayers. And they were following this as it was going. I'm old enough to remember the calling tree, right? But this is post that, so this was going on, and I was getting this play-by-play because the nurses were really good to communicate with me. This is what was going on. We arrived there, and it was as though they had rehearsed this. There were a half a dozen people waiting for us at the bay. It was like an episode of ER or something like that. And we raced in and raced down the hall, and one flight nurse was with me and one was with the team, and the one that was with me was explaining what was going on, and the one was with the team was updating them, and the one that was with me said, "Do you see this tall stoic lady over there?" And we were heading into the elevator. She said, if you could have any doctor caring for your kid at this age with this condition at this time, it's that lady right there. She's the boss. She's amazing. Her name's Shannon Buckfold, and you drew a good card here. She's great. Well, it happened to be shift change at 6 o'clock, so we had the outgoing pediatric cardiologist going off and the incoming one, Shannon Buckfold, coming on. So we actually had two, not one, pediatric cardiologist there because it was at shift change. So they were heading up. We went into the cardiac ICU on the 3rd floor, and I am a delayed reaction person. My wife has the ability to feel emotion in a moment much better than I do. Mine, it's in a board meeting when I'm presenting financials 3 weeks later. It just hits me at a completely inappropriate time, right? And she would be on this as it was happening. Well, I'm sort of standing in the corner just watching this happen. And like I'm in an audience or something, and she is at the foot of this bed, and she's got the report from the Flight for Life nurses. Our daughter is writhing around and squirming around. Her heart rate is somewhere in the low to mid 3s, and she's gasping for air. And she said, "Okay, go ahead and intubate her." And she sits down with me and she says, "Benjamin, my name's Shannon Buckfold, and I'm the pediatric cardiologist in charge of your daughter's care. And your daughter's really sick. And so to save her life, I'm going to have to administer a drug that's going to restart her heart. And in the shape that she's in, and as tired as she is, it might actually send her into cardiac arrest." Now, I'm not sure that's going to happen. In fact, I really hope it doesn't. And she may take the drug just fine. But in the event that she doesn't, and I have to put her on an extreme form of life support, I'm not going to have time to have this conversation with you again. Is this okay with you? I remember thinking, "Lady, whatever you say is good with me. Thanks for asking." Because I'm her dad. And no one's asked me yet. So she sat back down 2-3 minutes later and said, "Hey, sorry, good news. She took the drug just fine. Her heart rate's back at normal and her oxygen's back at 100%. Her heart's no longer in immediate danger. At this point, we're going to proceed this way. If her body reacts this way, we're going to proceed this way. If her body reacts that way, we're going to proceed that way. I just don't want you to be surprised. This is our plan. Do you have any questions? And is this okay with you?" And for 6 days, this is how the conversation continued. 6 days. She just continued to ask, "Are you okay with this?" And then she came back to me the next day and said, "Hey, Benjamin, I have an apology for you." And I said, "For what?" And she said, "Well, when I was intubating your daughter, I think I might have nicked one of her vocal cords." I said, "But you didn't intubate her. The anesthesia people did." She said, "Yeah, but I ordered it, and it's my care." And if I'd have used a tube one size smaller, it might have been different. And I don't know that it would have, but it might have. And it's just not perfect, and I'm really sorry. And I said, "Is there a chance it damages her ability to speak?" She said, "Uh-huh." I said, "Is there a chance that it's permanent?" She said, "There is, and I'm really sorry. I don't know that for sure, but we'll have an ENT come in and check her out." And the next day, the ENT came in and examined her that afternoon. There was no damage to her vocal cords, and in fact, I live with this almost 7-year-old little girl now. Trust me. She's normally the one that closes for me. She's in school today, but she'll come and stand near the microphone and tell you to please work together. And her vocal cords work just fine. But she she was honest with me. And I remember even before I knew that there was no damage thinking, I'm not holding you accountable for any of this because you were honest with me. You were in a really difficult situation, and did you do it perfectly? Maybe not. But I don't expect perfect, I expect honest. Don't expect perfect, I expect respect. I don't expect perfect, I expect inclusion. That's what I expect. And you were honest with me. And so that kind of communication happened. So here I was, with a daughter covered with tubes and wires and all these things, and just grateful to be here, holding my kid. And this woman walks in and says, "Hi, I'm Lucy. I'm an infection prevention specialist, and I'm here to make sure that your daughter and children are in clean environments and stay as safe as possible. I'm going to need your help in making sure that you sanitize your hands when you enter and leave the room. And may I have your commitment to do this with me?" And as she's doing that, she's saying, "I love you" by doing this, right? And I said, "Ma'am, I'm in. Thanks for including me in that. I'll make sure that if I touch anything other than her, I just put that sanitizer right next to this chair right here. I'm in good shape." And then she proceeded to mop the floors and clean the toilets. She was a housekeeper at that hospital. And I realized this isn't about a really good doctor. This woman sees herself as every bit as responsible for our daughter's outcome as that pediatric cardiologist does. This is a culture that values life and human dignity and safety. And so we were discharged just several days later, 6 days after getting there, and on our way out, we had this moment where we were going to go into the business office, and we had, while we were there, by the way, our son had been admitted into the NICU with an elevated heart rate that had turned out to be some sort of paraflu. And so we had one kid on the 4th floor, one kid on the 3rd floor, and we met our maximum out of pocket for both kids. And so I saw $20,000 in maximum out of pocket coming our way with our insurance. And I'm like, I know how this goes. I'm a hospital CEO. Here we go. I see a payment plan in our future. And we walked in and they said, "Yeah, we need your daughter's or your son's Medicaid number." And I said, "Well, they're not on Medicaid." And she said, "No, your daughter flew in from the hospital where she was born with a Medicaid number, and they're twins, right? That would lead us to believe that he's got one too. So where would we find that?" And I said, "Well, they're adopted, so they're now they're on our private insurance." And she said, "When was the adoption finalized?" And I said, "This upcoming Monday." She goes, "Yeah, Medicaid's a secondary payer. Have a nice day." I go, like, we're leaving. I was like, "Kill, I didn't even take my wallet out of my pocket. What just happened here?" They had a system in place that would protect us when we didn't know. And we were exhausted, right? It was just a way of capping that out. And so I was blown away by that. But I was left thinking, so what if it didn't have to happen this way? What if improved coordination through care partnerships would have prevented much of her suffering? And what if I, as the CEO of the first third of her care experience, could have prevented much of her suffering if I'd set that stuff in place? And so that really lays the foundation for the remainder of our talk. So lesson I learned is that every patient or family member deserves to participate in a collaborative process that allows patients and their providers to make health decisions together, taking account the best scientific evidence available as well as the patient's values and preferences. This is called shared decision making, right? It should be the floor, right? Not something to which we aspire. This is just basic stuff. And I think about the remarkable difference of these two people, Dr. Buchvold and Mr. Pediatric Cardiologist / electrophysiologist. This is what I do. And if he'd only known that I was going to end up on a speaking circuit, delivering this to 10,000 health leaders, maybe he would have had a better day. I don't know. Every person working in healthcare delivery plays a role in saving and improving the lives of patients. So where are we now? So I work, as I mentioned, at a full spectrum rural hospital. You have 13 in Vermont, right? Not all of them are rural or frontier hospitals, right? But a lot of them are rural, right? You're a rural state that for 50 years have done cutting edge work in population health. Thank you, by the way, as the recipient of the work that's been going on by Jack Wenberg and everyone else after that for 50 years. But we're a rural physician, or we're a rural family medicine hospital that provides beginning of life to end of life care. Our family doctors do everything from surgical obstetrics to inpatient care to ER and trauma to all that. And they go through one of 6 residencies in the United States that really are unopposed residencies that train doctors adequately to do this. And our OB outcomes are very good. In many ways, we're a very good hospital. We serve 20,000 patients in southwest Kansas. We're in a town of 2,200 people, and so women drive up to 2 hours to deliver a baby in our hospital. Sometimes through treacherous conditions to get there, and a few times a year they'll arrive with a woman and a baby in a back seat, and we'll begin a different episode of care when that happens. Anyway, so that's our reality. The Washington Post was nice enough to name us the 10th most remote town in the United States. It's not a contest we knew we were in. It's certainly not one that we were trying to win. But 15 miles east of us is Holcomb, Kansas, and 50 miles northeast of us is Scott City, Kansas, and about an hour and a half away is Oakley, Kansas, and an hour and a half or 2 hours away is Colby, Kansas, and 25 miles south is Ulysses, Kansas, and 50 miles east is 25 miles east is Dodge City, Kansas, and an hour east is 25 miles east is Garden City, Kansas, and an hour east is Dodge City, Kansas. We delivered babies from all of those places. Last year, we are up there with Montana. Except this is Montana. Y'all know where I'm going with this, right? This is Kansas. To be fair, this is half of Montana. This is all of Kansas. All right. So this is also Kansas. 30 countries in our service area. The world's largest beef packing plant is 15 miles east of us in Holcomb, Kansas. Think in cold blood. That's where it happened, right? For those of you who read the book, right? So that's where the largest beef packing plant in the world is. And so these people from all over the world work there, and they deliver babies in our hospitals. So we have a very diverse population in a very remote and conservative area of the United States. So put those two together and see what happens, right? So we've added nearly 7,000 new patients in a matter of just a few years. We're adding more patients to our practice than the size of our town every year the last 3 years. And we've gone from 100 babies a year to over 300 babies a year and continue to climb as maternity units close across rural America. We are simply saying if we're going to do OB, let's do it well. And to do it well, we need to do it often. We have a responsibility to moms to make sure we do this. And so we've relentlessly pursued those things. We've added 100 new jobs. And just when we thought we were really cool, I had a conversation with a woman named Elizabeth Teisberg that showed otherwise. We had seen a 21% increase in that period of time in our clinic visits, a 45% increase, half of which were unnecessary, not emergent, in the ED, and 126% increase in our non-obstetric hospital days. So that led us to wonder, are we actually helping people get better? Because if the bar on the left goes up, what should happen to the bar on the right? It should go down, right? That would if we're doing our job, if we're taking care of people. But it wasn't. So Elizabeth, who's now at Del Med, but was at Dartmouth when Steve and I were at Dartmouth, has become like a grandmother to our children and can get in my face about stuff. And she said, what makes you all so special? And I said, well, we know our patients by name. And she said, knowing their names doesn't mean you provide good care. It means you know their names. Whoop-de-doo. And I said, well, people drive up to 120 miles to deliver a baby in our hospital. She said, were there alternatives? And if I'm honest, we're better than nothing. Or better than our terrible neighbor. Maybe we're really good. We just couldn't prove it. So I said, well, we're a key access point. And she said, access to what? I said, access to really good care. And she asked, can you prove that? And anybody that knows Elizabeth and knows Michael Porter and knows Redefining Healthcare, the book they wrote 2005, knows that these are the questions, of course, Elizabeth's going to ask. She was asking them nicely, but she was still asking them directly. And she said, so often we ask patients when they leave the hospital if the sheets were soft and if the bed was comfortable, if the nurses were nice, if the food was warm, if it was delivered on time, if the doctor was cute. We have one really cute doctor named Dr. Miller, right? So we don't actually ask if the doctors were cute, but essentially we're asking, how did we do? What should we ask in a patient when they leave the hospital? Huh? How are you? How are you? You feeling any better? Is your chest still hurt? Your blood pressure still high? Did you take your blood pressure meds? Did you get your script filled? Do you ever ride to the pharmacy? Do you have prescription drug insurance? Are you choosing between drugs and food? What are you going to choose if you're choosing between drugs and food? Maslow figured it out, right? You're going to choose food, right? We weren't asking the right questions. So I said, but we're pretty good for a small town. And she said, what are you saying about small towns? Ow. So fatalism had been setting into my own heart that we're pretty good for where we are. Why can't we just be pretty good, period? Why can't we just be really good, period? So this was my perception of our overall outcomes, illustrated by 2 of our kids. And this is our reality. Or at very best, this may be a typical day at our house. And to be fair, my wife gave him a completely full bowl of spaghetti on purpose because she said it entertained them for nearly an hour. So that's the wife and mom I get to live with. She's legit. She's really good. So at very best, though, we don't know. And so we engaged the KU School of Medicine to help us figure that. And I'm going to bring up Chris Wilhelm just for a few minutes toward the close of our presentation to talk with you. Chris is a Rural Healthcare Leadership Fellow in between undergrad and med school. You've got a chance to snag him now. He's applying to med schools. Is doing some really interesting work with us and is helping organize a Baylor internship that has happened each of the last 4 years that helps us engage our community in asking them what matters most to them. And Chris is going to explain what happened over the next couple of minutes.
So like Benjamin said, I'm Chris. I just graduated in May from Baylor and have the opportunity to be in remote Kansas for a year as I apply to medical school and work on some of the research that is happening in Southwest Kansas as we look at answering that question, how are you, when we ask our patients that. So like Benjamin said, we got with this woman at KU Med School in Wichita to put together an IRB certified research survey that could go out to our community to ask the patients, ask the people that come into our hospital, how are you and what is healthcare? What should healthcare be? What is wellness? What is health to you? What do you look for in these things? Who provides your healthcare? And in Southwest Kansas, we were able to get an 85% response rate. And that's not duplicated responses, that's 85%. And we were able to do this because of relationships. One of the things that Benjamin and other community members in Lakin have done such a great job at are building relationships, building the first name basis, going into the grumpy old man's room and becoming his friend so he knows that he matters. And we didn't just ask people like Benjamin to go out into our community. We didn't just ask, the higher ups of Southwest Kansas to go out. We asked the people that have friendships. We asked the people that have relations with every member in the community. We went to the library, we went to school functions, we went to the pool, daycare centers, the nursing home, to make sure every person that we could get to was able to answer the survey, able to respond to us with, who provides your healthcare? How are you doing? How are we doing? How is wellness, delivered here in Southwest Kansas? And it was great. We had people, granted, we did bribe them. We gave gift cards if you finished the survey. So that definitely helps with getting the 85% response rate. But people appreciated the fact that people were coming out and asking them, how are you? Everyone likes to be asked how you are, because we don't really ask that all that often. And with that, we found out some kind of nasty things. In every category, our white population was more aware of resources available than our Hispanic populations. And every category, that's not good. We say we are delivering all, we're saying we're delivering great care, but we have a population that doesn't know what care is available, doesn't know what resources are available to them. And then we also found in every category except for 3, our Hispanic populations wanted more access to care. They wanted more availability. They wanted more resources. And with this, we are now able to hopefully work on fixing some of those inequities, providing resources, providing opportunities that every population can get access to, as opposed to just the one population that knows that it's available. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Benjamin so he can continue on with the presentation.
So this was a nasty look in the mirror and a smelling of our own armpits and realizing that we stink. And because we think, okay, our doctors are getting 10 weeks of paid time off to serve anywhere in the world they want to go. They're culturally competent. We get a call every 2 to 3 weeks from a doctor that wants to work in our remote location because there's an opportunity to pursue equity and justice and all these things. But when we looked at our report card and we figured out that if a service isn't available in a person's language that they can understand or at a time that they can access it with shift work or in a way that is culturally acceptable for them to receive it, it doesn't exist at all, or worse, this drink in a fountain ain't for you. It's here, it just ain't for you. And so that's something we've had to look really hard at. So initially it was overwhelming, so we had to think, so what now? So what we did is what I would encourage you all to consider if you're on this same road toward equity that we are. Start small, pick one meaningful thing to measure. And what we chose to focus on were the non-emergent ED visits. The ED visits that are levels 4 and 5, or 1 and 2, however your EMR works it out, but the ones that are not actually emergent, not the questionable ones or the ones that are obviously ought to be there, but just the ones that were, there's no question that this ought to be in an urgent care center or not in here at all, or in a mental health center or wherever else. Let's try to reduce those per month, and let's try to increase the number of primary care visits per month, because let's get people to outpatient care and get them out of the ED if possible, if it benefits them. And so we determined how to measure it. We looked at the less emergent and non-emergent categories, levels 4 and 5, and then we set a goal, and we basically made it a ratio of non-emergent ED visits over clinic visits. And so we went from that and figured out that we wanted to get this benchmark looks arbitrary, except if you know the context. And so we knew that if non-emergent ED visits went down and clinic visits stayed the same, the ratio would improve. And if clinic visits went up and the non-emergent ED visits went down, then the ratio would improve, because we were growing and we knew we were adding so many patients. But if both could go inversely at the same time, we knew we'd see a dramatic reduction. And so then we asked, well, we're not meeting this goal because we answered those questions. We looked back at the community priorities, and this is white and Hispanic folks together, because primarily white and Hispanic people live in our county. A lot of the diversity lives in the surrounding counties. So we combined all of the participants of this survey together and looked at the most commonly requested service, which was non-emergent ED visits. After hours non-emergency care was what people were seeking. They couldn't get in after they get off at Tyson Foods. There just wasn't something that would accommodate with their shift work. And so then we asked, or we answered the question, we couldn't achieve our goal really, or even expand clinic hours until we had more primary care, because we were turning away 50 patients a week at the time, not now, but at the time, turning away 50 patients a week. And so we found more doctors. So then we asked which stakeholders care. What can they share? And we just went through a list of stakeholders. And I have here, when we asked and we engaged the community, moms cared if we had physicians. Parents are stakeholders, but dads in our community were decidedly indifferent if we had doctors. They really didn't want a colonoscopy, right? Moms were decidedly interested if we had physicians. And so we engaged all of these different stakeholders, and do not overlook the little old ladies in a community. They really care. Little old ladies are moms too, and they really care if you have physicians. So these were the stakeholders that were most interested in being engaged in this process. And then we asked, what can they share? And our specific lists of what they could share really aren't as important to the audience or to you as just knowing to track down which stakeholders are engaged in this and want to do something about it, and what resources they have to share. So we looked at all of those things, and the two most important stakeholders for us in changing this outcome were who? It's easy. Moms and little old ladies, right? They were the ones that really moved the needle on helping us out. So we set a goal for 3 years that we were going to get this done. And then we looked at the typical physician profiles. Who moves to a rural community? And we figured out that there's the local kid. Steve Leffler and I both know a guy named Dr. Arlo Reimer, who went through the same program we did, who's from rural Kansas, grew up, came home. If you find one of them, Merry Christmas. There aren't very many of them coming back to their hometown to practice primary care. The foreigner, and I use that word knowing that it can come off condescending, but the J1H1B doctor who is really perceived in a rural place as the foreigner, the only one that speaks Arabic in West Kansas, right? As they come out, well, they many times can provide great care for a season, sometimes not so great care because the culture they came from, farmers were third-rate people, right? Well, in a rural community, they're the backbone of a community, so sometimes there's a challenge there, but often stay 3 to 5 years and then peace out. They go to the city because they'd like to be in a community that also speaks Arabic, right? Or whatever. So just not a long-term sustainable strategy. The troublemaker that cuts up goats in his front yard, or drinks a mysterious red potion and slurs his words at work, or steals drugs from the clinic and gives them to his girlfriend who's the PACU nurse, or has this training issue, throws instruments at staff, shows up at the interview with a significant other he met on the road on the way to the interview. Like, all of these things happened in West Kansas. Get on the Kansas State Board of Healing Arts and you will find them. And I think she was from a gentleman's club. I'm just saying. Okay. So there are plenty in West Kansas that meet that criteria. The money doctor, pay me $500,000 or $1 million and I'll go somewhere, I'll go anywhere until somebody pays me one more dollar than that and I'm out. Again, not sustainable for a rural community. And then there's the missionary, the one that's driven, the way we would define is the one that's driven by a sense of mission or purpose. It's greater than themselves, and the greater the need, the more people are drawn there. And so that's the one we figured out we wanted. And if we could find that one with local ties, we knew it really was a Merry Christmas at that point. That's a great situation. So this was our medical provider team in 2015. This is our medical provider team now. All but 2 are millennials. We're getting a call every 2 weeks from a doctor that wants to work there. I would be happy to answer questions as to how we got there. That's a whole different presentation. But if you are struggling with recruitment, I would love to visit with you about that after this presentation. This is what happens to that ratio we were tracking when you add that kind of primary care into a region. And we've actually gone further and recruited about 20 medical providers into our whole region, helping 6 of our neighbors recruit the same way. And so it's changing the face of primary care in Southwest Kansas. We've added evening clinic, that's part of it. But we're still, I think in closing, fighting perverse incentives. We all know these things, right? We get $2,200 for sticking somebody in a hospital swing bed, and we get comparatively nothing from Medicare to keep them out of it. So I was back up at Dartmouth at the Symposium on Healthcare Delivery with a friend of mine whose name is Craig Kincannon. He's an internist in rural Kansas, and he was having a conversation with Elizabeth Teisberg that turned into an argument, one-sided argument, because she really wasn't arguing, he was, and he was just saying CMS doesn't know rural. They hold us accountable to measures that don't make any sense in our context. And she responded calmly, and she said, perhaps they don't, so teach them. Here's the takeaway for you all. Pick one meaningful thing to measure that improves outcomes and lowers costs, and show them how you did it. They don't know rural, and they're desperate, especially right now, ahead of the 2020 election. They are desperate to know what's going on in rural. Why are we waiting on the federal government to fix our problems? She said, you fix them. So here's the tool we used. What outcome needs improvement? Which stakeholders are involved? Where are the opportunities to share? Why isn't it already happening? How do we measure its success? When do we expect to see some progress? Implement strategy, repeat. Now what outcome needs improvement? We don't get a pass because we are rural. We don't get to exempt ourselves from the quality discussion because we are rural. We must voluntarily hold ourselves accountable to outcomes, not separating rural from others. I get the volume thing. I get that we don't have the volume, and so our numbers can look like, so we scale it over multiple years. So we get together in groups and measure our outcomes together. We find some way that we can legitimize ourselves in the care we're providing by measuring the outcomes that matter. And our strategy for doing that is pursuing value-based care. We hack the system. We measure the outcomes for hacking the system. Hacking the system by meaning we find funding to get paid for things that we don't normally get paid for, track the outcomes for doing the right thing, and then bring those outcomes to payers, and that's what's happening right now, and then we repeat it. So as I was leaving Children's Hospital, I knocked on the president's door. I hadn't shaved in a week. I might have looked homeless. I don't know. But I was grateful. And I walked in and said, your name is Jim Schmierling. You're the president of Children's Hospital Colorado. You don't know me from anybody, but I'm the dad of a patient whose life was just saved here. And I want to share that story with you. Can you go to lunch with me? And he looked at his assistant and said, can I go? And she said, sure. So we went downstairs and we went to lunch. And I sat down and told him our story and said, how can you develop a culture where the housekeeper sees herself is every bit as responsible for the life and well-being and safety of our daughter as a pediatric cardiologist? And he says, we walk through the halls of this place, we have these arguments, we haggle over who's responsible for care. Is it the government? Is it the church? Is it the hospital? Is it patients themselves? Who's responsible for the outcomes of this thing? And I think these are kids we're talking about. They've done nothing to deserve barriers to care of their children. And their lives hang in the rafters as we fight over this stuff. At the end of the day, this work is about people. This work is about people. These outcomes are tied to people and loved ones. He's now in Connecticut Children's Hospital, but what outcome do you think matters most to me? That one. And it's not just that she's alive. It's that I get to show her creation. I get to experience the mountains with her. It's that I get to take her into a hospital and show her the same practices that saved her life. It's that we get to be a family of 6 instead of a family of 5. And I'm so grateful to people, just like those that are among you, that took the time to stop and say, how are you doing? What are your hopes? What are your hopes for your kid? What are your hopes for your family? What matters the most to you? How are you doing, Dad? How you doing, Mom? And I think it's so important that we remember that amidst all this trauma that we're dealing with. I was just at a regional policy board meeting in DC a few days ago. Oof, it was hard to listen to all the bantering back and forth, but at the end of the day, everybody knows a Naomi, right? And that's what we're doing it for. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you having us.